Hi there, my name is Nate Kokernot. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to tackle the concept of the free energy principle, which I think I alluded to in one of the Hermetic Principle videos. It's something that has been rolling around for quite a while now. There's a psychologist, and I guess he was also, I found out, a mathematician, named Karl Friston, who coined the term the free energy principle. And I think it encompasses a lot of the Hermetic principles, the way that I see it. And it also really explains how, well, in the most broadest general terms, how the balance of order and chaos persists in the world. For one, it's actually introduced the concept of negentropy. So entropy is basically the idea that systems just get increasingly more complex. But negentropy is it was a word that was coined as basically the purposeful concentration of energy to create order, the opposite of entropy. So conscious, intentional action to maintain structure. We're talking here about things like mindfulness and intentionality. I've found in my own day-to-day routine, the more that I slow down and act with intention, the more equilibrium, emotional equilibrium, being not reactive to things, exists for me. So I guess this presentation is going to really highlight the brain as basically its job is to create negentropy and then a sense of homeostasis, so as to make us not go completely crazy in an environment in which it seems that disorder is just boundlessly being created. And the brain is actually tasked with the job, just like physiology is tasked with the job of creating a state of homeostasis or balance within the internal system. And I can see in the world how many different systems the free energy principle applies to. For example, just the simple act of cleaning your house of all the clutter. I have lots of clients who've shared with me just how cluttered their mind gets when their immediate environment is filled with clutter. That is basically, by cleaning your house, you are creating order out of disorder, bringing entropy back into balance. Another example I use in the medical is the cancer cells. If you go and you have a cancer screening of some sort, your doctor might tell you, oh, you've got some very abnormal cells in that region, this particular region of your body. Well, the body itself physiologically is always creating abnormal cells, but it also has systems to balance that out and basically make those abnormal cells disappear. So if you're going to completely freak out when the doctor tells you that you have the potential for cancer in you, you don't have the emotional equilibrium to basically restore the order, and very likely the cancer is going to spread. If instead you recognize that the free energy principle exists within the physiology of the body, just like it does in the brain, you can imagine that there are already forces in place within the body that are going to basically normalize those abnormal cells, bring them back into harmony with the rest of the physiology of the body, and you don't have to basically react at all to the cancer diagnosis. You just don't believe it. You just say, this is the dance physiologically speaking, between order and disorder at play. And as long as I maintain my emotional equilibrium and don't lose my shit, this will all take care of itself without me needing to spend lots of money and whatnot on all of these cancer treatments that we've devised today. I'm pretty much an opponent of the whole idea of cancer. I do have a cynical view that there's a massively a lucrative industry that has formed just around this idea of cancer, and the whole thing was basically made up by the human brain in the first place, and we could undo it just as easily as we made it up. And that's something that I've been aware of since my trip to New Zealand when I was like 23 years old, that there are countless stories of people who have healed themselves of very advanced stages of cancer simply through faith. Of course, the placebo effect, of course, comes into this as well. That as long as you believe something, it's got power. And I've told you, I think before, that I have a client who, although he wasn't, I can't take credit for it, he just needed a therapist who was not going to be skeptical of what he was doing, that he basically turned around a stage 4 cancer with the help of Joe Dispenza and his techniques of mind over matter, which are also very driven by science. He always carries around with him a team of data specialists who collect data from all of his workshops and then publish the data to prove that mind over matter is just the fact of all of our health issues in general. So those are a couple of examples. I've mentioned waves as an example. The way that waves break is an example of the free energy principle, and then they reform. And I've talked about how there's a cycle to the waves that surfers are very familiar with, that it tends to be about 7 or 8 cycles. And that brings in one of the Hermetic principles of rhythm into the story. I think that all of the Hermetic principles are probably tied in with this new principle, the free energy principle, that yes, there is a rhythm to the order and the disorder. And in a previous episode, I talked about the decades being kind of like the waves, in that, if you follow the work of Neil Strauss, who wrote The Fourth Turning Is Here, as well as his first book called Generations, which he did with his collaborator who has since died, that there is a rhythm to the decades of history, and every 83, 84 years approximately, there is a huge collapse into disorder. And in a previous episode, I showed a little chart that I'll show again here, that, we can just look at the last 3 major wars, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the World War II, all being about 80 some odd years apart from each other. And then if you add 80 some odd years to World War II, you get right now, which is, we're reliving it yet again, but it's all part of a greater cycle. I've talked a little bit about astrology and how it appears as though Uranus, which is kind of the electric shock planet, big shocking events, big change, freedom, it's every time it re-enters the sign of Gemini, which is kind of a sign that represents duality, opposites, and polarity. Again, there's another Hermetic principle that, this one set of people basically regards this other set of people as evil. And isn't it interesting that that set of people regards this first set of people as evil? That's the duality. And then Uranus comes in to the sign of Gemini every 83 years, and I think it stays for 7 years in there, and basically creates a huge conflict in the world, and we're seeing it now. So back to the free energy principle and the idea of homeostasis, and maybe even to bring in the idea of the surfer who's riding on top of the waves. Many of us who are familiar with William Strauss or Neil Strauss's work, who are familiar with astrology, we are not surprised by any of what appears to be happening in the world right now. The level of chaos and disorder that exists is just right on schedule. And so the free energy principle at its heart is really about, in all systems, but we're going to focus on the brain especially, about minimizing surprise for the sake of equilibrium, so that our central nervous systems are not dysregulated. And if you start to see the rhythm and the cycles and understand all of these principles and how they're all blended together, you basically stay on top of the waves like a good surfer does, instead of getting crushed by the waves like a novice or somebody who's never been to the ocean before discovers. We've all had that moment at some point where we're getting tumbled by the waves, and it's simply because we don't understand the principles, the energy that is behind them. So Karl Friston talks a lot about, because he was a psychologist, he talks about the brain in particular. He is a big fan of Freud's. Freud had concept of the ego as basically the balancer between what he called the id and the superego. And the id could be called our libido, our base instincts to get things. That's the pleasure-seeking principle. Unbounded, anybody who is just seeking pleasure constantly, they're going to have some consequences that come down the line. So there's this other part of the brain called the superego, which is basically more about principles and values, and the way that Freud sort of saw the ego itself is the central kind of figure between the id and the superego, creating a balance between them. And so because Karl Friston is first and foremost a psychologist, and he was really seeing both mathematically and energetically how the free energy principle functions in the brain, I'm going to focus mostly on just the topic of psychology here. So some of the terms that are necessary to understand is the term homeostasis, which along with allostasis resists the forces of entropy. In other words, if it were just entropy, that systems are getting more and more complex and disordered, then I think by now this world would just be like a complete wasteland. There would be no life on it. But life itself seems to regenerate despite all of the cataclysms and all of that. Allostasis is termed or is defined as the mind's ability to change and to create new models of the external environment to maintain balance and emotional equilibrium. And entropy would be the unbounded, just one direction towards chaos and disorder, which clearly isn't the case. Back to the history lesson. Every winter period, which is those periods when the waves are breaking, in Neil Strauss's works, or it's not Neil Strauss, it's William Strauss, and it's Neil Howe, sorry. The fourth turning is here, it's just Neil Howe. But he says every winter period, which would be the wars, the conflict, the periods of conflict that last, approximately 7 years, but they're defined by other cataclysms. And in this particular phase, those cataclysms would be the 2008 housing crisis that brought the stock market down. That's what he sees as when we came into this period. And then, of course, COVID, global pandemic was a big part of it. And now, it seems as though we're on the edge of civil war and possibly world war. But that's all just part of the cycle. And after winter, every year comes spring, a time of restoration, a time of coming into spiritual truths again. And that's what I'm that's what I'm really all about, is the spiritual truths, because I think the Hermetic principles, which are really foundational to science, are completely aligned with the spiritual truths that I learned from A Course in Miracles. And most of what Karl Friston seems to be talking about in terms of highlighting this free energy principle in the realm of psychology is about intentionality. Intentionality is basically the same as mindfulness. And today's lesson in A Course in Miracles is called I Could See Peace Instead of This. So if we meditated on an idea like that really, and I think this is true of every single one of us, what we really, really want more than anything, in truth, is to see peace. And because the brain constructs the pictures it sees, so this is bringing in a little bit of Donald Hoffman stuff. Yes, so the Helmholtz model of the brain has it that the brain makes its own world. So we're going to talk a little bit about those efferent and those afferent nerves. Efferent nerves would be also called top-down nerves, and afferent nerves are bottom-up nerves. In other words, the afferent bottom-up nerves are sending information from the sensory organs like the eyes and the ears up to the brain and the central nervous system. And the efferent nerves are sending information from the brain and the central nervous system to the sensory systems or the sensory organs. Logically, if our eyes were just like a camera recording what's actually there in the veridical world, the true objective reality of what's there, if that were the case, then most of the nerves between the brain and the sensory organs would be what we'd call afferent or bottom up, that they would just be sending all the information to the brain about what's there. But like Helmholtz discovered, and Donald Hoffman, the cognitive scientist who I talk about all the time, he has also discovered that no, it's actually mostly the brain constructing the reality that we see, all for the purpose, again, to minimize surprise and to create objects and what Donald Hoffman refers to as fitness payoffs, which would basically be like points in a video game, so that we get the things that we want, whatever those things are. We see what we want, whether it be, if we're in a state of hunger, then it's a steak or some other food item. If we're in a state of horniness, it's a member of the opposite sex. All the fitness payoffs. And the brain is actually doing most of the construction of the images that we see, rather than the previous assumption that's basically already been discredited by serious science, that we're just passively observing what's there in the world. We're not. So part of the reason why the free energy principle seems to, let's use the Hermetic principle, as above, so below, that the free energy principle does extend to all systems. Information theory was the basis for Karl Friston's research, but also biology and physiology and psychology. but it's also in every realm of our lives, and that's basically because we're constructing what we see, and we're trying to create some order in what we see. The brain is tasked with that job, and it's all for the point of minimizing surprise. That's at the heart of free energy principle. Karl Friston also pulls attachment theory into the mix in his article, and I'm going to share that article in the more section just below the video if you want to take a deeper dive into it. But he brings attachment theory into it, and he has a really beautiful expression of what securely attached people, what the conditions of their early life are in relation to their caregivers, that they basically they find that they can depend on their caregivers, one, to acknowledge their pain, two, to tolerate the protests, and three, to help them move on from it. So, as young children, we're all basically clean slates, and social learning is basically just learning through observation of others. And the securely attached individual happens to have the good fortune of having parents who have already established for themselves homeostasis, emotional equilibrium, the ability to move on, the ability to stay out of victimization mentality, because if you have a victimization mentality, that you are a victim of the world around you, that's gonna influence what you see, the images that you construct with your brain. If that's the basis, if that's the belief that forms the foundation of your orientation towards life, yes, you're going to continue to have experiences of victimhood. But this world is full of adversity. There are always going to be shocking and alarming occurrences in our lives, but securely attached people have got the benefit of that ability to restore order, and it is the brain's job to do that. So I've said a lot. As always, I've connected quite a lot of dots here today, and I apologize if it's too many tangents, but it is just the way that my brain likes to operate. It's basically like my purpose, and Karl Friston makes this clear too in his article that I read yesterday about free energy principle. And I also just want to emphasize that there is a behavioral aspect to all of this. Although mindfulness and intentionality are all basically internal processes, it does flow down into your behavior. And the idea is, if we have achieved that ability to always restore, to repair the false meaning in things, and see it in a different way, to see it from a place of internal peace, it's one of the points is that gives you the equilibrium, the emotional equilibrium, to not be emotionally reactive to things that are happening around you, so that you yourself are not contributing to the chaos. It's not that any of this evidence is absolute empirical evidence to override other people's assumptions. This is really just a lot of circumstantial evidence that he's pointing at and I'm pointing at. In my book, How to Change the World by Changing Your Mind, it's just like loads and loads of circumstantial evidence. None of it can be proven definitively, but our hope is to basically overwhelm you with enough circumstantial evidence to say, yeah, it's starting to get hard to deny that there is something else happening here beyond our limited scope of what we can take in with our sensory organs. One, because our sensory organs are not everywhere in the world at once, so we can't possibly understand everything in the world because we can't even see everything in the world at once. And our brains are constructing it to begin with. And it's all for the sake of trying to create some sense of homeostasis within us in the internal state of the organism. So I'm saying all this in hopes that you guys who are viewing this can really appreciate that it's, even in times like this, filled with cataclysm and surprises every day, there is a way to get above those waves and ride them and basically not lose your shit. And that's all for today. I hope that you all have a wonderful day full of blessings and miracles, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.